Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In this episode, I am calling it a self-assessment. And what I want to do is ask a question specifically to the Russian audience. I know I do have some Russian audience members out there that obviously are in the Russian Federation. And the question I would like to ask, and I'm also going to kind of jump in and do a little bit of a review, especially in the early stages of the Russian-NATO-Ukrainian conflict. Now again, my real question as a Russian, do you believe the Russian military, the Russian ground forces, the Russian Air Force, the Russian Navy, all aspects of the Russian military, and specifically the higher echelons of the Russian command staff, have they done and can they do a self-assessment of what has transpired in this conflict? Obviously, the Russian military, the Russian general staff, made some serious mistakes in terms of preparing for the conflict and then executing the conflict. Now, obviously, there is a political aspect to this that may have or may not have limited the Russian design for the initial stages of the conflict. Now, specifically, what I'd like to look at is the early stages of the conflict, right? So, going into the war, and let's not mix words, okay? It's a war. You can call it a special military operation, whatever you want to do is fine. It's a military conflict. It's a war. And I would say that any reasonable Russian looking at what's happening now and kind of experiencing what has happened would, in circles of close friends, would say war, not special military operation. And again, that's where the ability to kind of self-reflect has a concern for that I'm concerned with, right? Sticking with that word, right? Special military operation is indicative of an entrenched thought process that one may not be able to escape from at this point. I'm just saying, just the case example. But anyway, going back to the initial stages of the war, right? The preparatory buildup. The Russians were utilizing the battalion tactical groups. It's not really doing that now. I mean, but obviously, knowing what we know now, probably not the best decision, especially at least in terms of doctrine and the inability of the Russian Air Force to directly support these battalion tactical groups and aggressive military operations. I don't think it just happened the way the Russians had planned it. But more importantly, as we, going into the early stages of the conflict and the early preparatory stages, look, the Russian ground forces numbered about 300,000. I believe there's been a number of 280 to about 300,000 batted around. Then you throw in the airborne forces, the VDV, the coastal forces, the naval infantry, and what have you, and maybe you're pushing about 350,000 or so troops. Best case, 400,000, probably, maybe, right? But then you look at the Ukrainian force construct at the beginning of the conflict, and they probably had in the neighborhood of 300,000 troops, right? So we know that in the early stages of the conflict, the Russians deployed about 190,000 troops into the Ukraine, facing a Ukrainian force of about 300,000 troops. So in theory, the Ukrainians, as the defender, may have outnumbered the Russians in some places, right? Very possible. Now, I would say where I have been wrong about this conflict, and I have the ability to self-reflect, and especially the early stages of the conflict, right? Even looking at the Russian force construct of being about 190,000, I believe they had about what was it, about 80 battalion tactical groups that could have been deployed into the Ukraine. Now, again, early on, like before the battle started, before the first Russian troops crossed the Ukrainian border, I had believed myself, right, that the Russian Air Force would have been much more effective than what it was. Okay? Now look, this is just a conversation. This is just a conversation. What I would like is just to have feedback in the comment section about what you think as a Russian. Okay? And anyone else who wants to join in and apply a analytical viewpoint to this conflict. Now, again, those 100,000, 190,000 Russian troops deployed into these battalion tactical groups, if they had been supported by a more technologically advanced Air Force. Like, for instance, if and this is really a no-brainer, right? I don't think anyone would argue this, that if the Russians had the support of a U.S. style Air Force, that they would have probably done better. Okay? Now, going into this conflict, I knew that the Russians were not actively using advanced targeting pods. And I bring that up quite a bit because I think it's very important. I think it's incredibly it's underestimated just how those targeting pods have helped and that sort of technology has helped the U.S. military be very, very effective. And a lot of nation states around the world have adopted some of those targeting pod systems or have built their own targeting pods. The Chinese have them. Obviously, the Israelis have them. Most European nation states have them. Usually, right, if you're a fairly advanced Air Force, you're going to be utilizing these more advanced targeting pods. And look, even India using the Su-30 have I believe they're using an Israeli targeting pod that that interfaces with the software of those Su-30s for the Indian Air Force. How many they have, I'm not sure offhand, but they do use them. But they also use other Western aircraft as well that deploy those systems. But point being, going into this, I knew the Russians weren't really using them. I knew they had a kind of an internal targeting system that was used for the Su-34 fullback. But it's glaringly apparent that to use that system, those aircraft need to get very close, or much closer than a more high-resolution FLIR-type system, which the Russians do have. It's just the resolutions aren't as high. Now, what I did believe that the Russians had, and we would probably see those deployed in this conflict, probably more so than other conflicts we've seen the Russians involved in, and that's the use of obviously their attack helicopters, the K-52, the Mi-28, and upgraded variants of the Mi-24 Hind. And we can see that the Russians have put FLIR systems on those aircraft. But if we look at, for instance, the early stages of the battle for the Hostomel airport, right? That system, those systems, especially in the airborne operation to take control of Hostomel, did not appear to be used, right? So in that early attack on Hostomel, the Russians, I believe, initiated its airborne assault, its air assault, at dawn, at about 7 o'clock in the morning. I believe it was daylight when the first Russian paratroopers hit Hostomel Airport, actually departed their helicopters, landed, and then initially seized control of the airport. And they were being supported by Russian helicopter gunships that were using not precision-guided long-range missile systems, right? If this would have been like an American operation, you would have seen Apache gunships, you would have seen Predator drones, Reaper drones, using Hellfire missiles and other missile systems at standoff ranges, using their FLIR systems to identify targets on the ground around the airport. What we saw from the Russians in this conflict were age-old strafing runs by these helicopters, coming in with their guns and free flight rockets, non-precision guided rockets, S-8 rockets, firing at Ukrainian forces. And I'm not even sure that the Russians had organic, actual Russian air support that was being used to hit some of these Ukrainian positions. We know that several cruise missiles were used to strike the Ukrainian barracks facilities of some of their National Guard units and regular Army units that were deployed in this area. But to my understanding, the Ukrainians were able to deploy a few MiG-29s against Russian forces, and at least the Ukrainians claim to have shot down a couple of Russian helicopters with those MiG-29s, right? Now, are we 100% certain on that? No, not really. Now, did the Russians take Hostomel Airport? Yeah, they did. They were able to do that. Even with a dawn attack, an attack that was launched essentially during daylight hours, right? Now, compare and contrast, if this would had been an American military operation, it would have looked much different. It just would have, in a lot of different aspects. Okay, number one, it would most certainly the initial air landing stages that would have taken place would have occurred at night, not during the day. And when we see the Russian forces, the Russian airborne troops dismount And there's been banter back and forth on this. And this is just one, point that, me as a viewer, that I am seeing. And when these Russian airborne infantry depart their helicopters, they don't appear to be using a night vision, right? Well, it was daylight, so it's probably something they didn't need. But at the same time, they're also not using optics on their rifles. So again, just one difference that is something that I noticed. Now, what happened next? Well, the big thing for the Russians is the Ukrainians were able to counterattack. And how did they do this? Well, they did it with the use of artillery, right? Ukrainian military formations were able to approach the airport, and they called in and utilized saturation, multiple launch rocket systems, and heavy artillery, 152, 122 millimeter Soviet-era artillery systems to attack the airport. And they were effectively able to crater the airport, which prevented follow-on Russian forces. Right? Now, again, going into the conflict, I would have believed that given that the seizure of this airfield was incredibly important for the Russians, very important, creating that landing bridge, and we're not even going to get into too much of the concept of the landing that may have been attempted by the Russians southwest of Kyiv, which obviously was a non-starter if it in fact had been launched. Now there's rumors out there that the Russians did try to seize this airport, and again, rumors that have not been substantiated claim that Russian air transport aircraft were shot down en route to this airfield. Now, again, the Russians, I don't believe, for whatever reason, actually tried to seize the airport, or a decision was made early on because of challenges elsewhere and Ukrainian capability that existed, that was waived off. That operation was waived off by the Russians. But back up here to Hostomel, given the seriousness of establishing this air bridge and seizing control of this airfield, that would have been a key objective in terms of supporting capability by the Russian Air Force, right? This would have been a pivotal point in the execution of the air support operation, in which, at least, from my viewpoint, the Russians did not have the ability to target and destroy those Ukrainian units that then cratered the airfield. Again, very, very important operation. And as a military commander, as a battlefield commander, I would have been, that would have been my number one worry, right? My number one worry, that there would be a counterattack and the airfield would be cratered. And worst case scenario, as my paratroopers are being brought in on transport aircraft, they're either shot down, or the transport aircraft and the disembarking troops are then engaged by accurate and sustained heavy artillery fire. So again, as a member of the Russian General Staff, you would think that that would have been mission number one. We have to seize this airport, and we have to do everything we can to prevent the Ukrainians from cratering the airfield and taking control of it, right? They didn't do that. And they didn't do that because I just don't think the Russians, going into this conflict, had that capability. I think they could seize the airport, but the Russian Air Force just didn't have the capability to keep the Ukrainians off that airfield in terms of using artillery to crater it. They just didn't. And in that mission, in terms of planning and organization, failed. Yes, they seized control of the airfield, and eventually Russian follow-on forces coming out of Belarus from the north were able to roll in and seize control of the airfield, and ultimately, even then, the Russians could have repaired the airfield and used it as an airfield to bring in follow-on forces. They didn't do it. They didn't do that because, again, the Ukrainians continued to shell that airfield. And it really just seemed to become a lost cause for the Russians to do anything more with it. And it looked like their main objective was then to just do this all from the ground, from Belarus and forces coming out north of Chernihiv, and create an enveloping operation where Russian forces would come in from the north and attempt to attack Kyiv from the east, while Russian forces from Belarus would attack in an encircling operation from the west. And they tried, and they weren't able to do it. Now, and again, this is where this self-reflecting comes in, right? And I think it's important. Based on my military experience, honest self-reflection in terms of how your unit performed, what you were able to do, what you were not able to do, and this goes all the way up the chain, right? From the battlefield commander to the platoon commander, right? At all levels. And to this day, right, I continuously get pushback that the Russians actually didn't try to seize Kyiv. And I think that's utterly ridiculous. I do believe the Russians attempted to take Kyiv, and they failed. Now, again, this is where self-reflection is important. The sum of the Russian pushback is that, well, there was a ceasefire, and I don't buy it. Okay, I believe the Russians tried to take Kyiv, but the Russians tried to do too much with not enough forces, right? I mean, this is one major operation near Kyiv and the environments around Kyiv, but we had other mini operations going on at the same time. We had operations coming out of the Crimea. We had operations near Kharkov. We had operations in Novorossiya and Donetsk and Luhansk. So a broad scope of military operations going on right now, and probably not enough forces that were committed by the Russians. And I believe that in all probability the Russians had committed almost everything they had. And therein lies the question, right? If the Russian ground forces would have been significantly larger, and for the life of me, the Russians had to know the capabilities or lack of capability in the Russian Air Force. Now look, if the Russian Air Force had been much more proficient, and not just proficient, had access to some technologies that I even believe the Russians had, that were used sparingly in this conflict, and that's regarding precision-guided weapon systems being used by their attack helicopters, and then the capability of strike aircraft, Su-34s, Su-24s, Su-25s. Some of these systems had been upgraded, right? But their ability to use standoff precision-guided munitions was glaringly apparent absent in the early stages of this conflict, other than the use of long-range cruise missiles that may or may not have been very effective in this conflict. Okay? So essentially you had a Russian force that entered the Ukraine that was essentially outnumbered, fighting an enemy on the defensive who was rapidly mobilizing much quicker, right, than what the Russians could mobilize. Early phases of the Kyiv operation, there was about 5,000 Ukrainian troops in and around Kyiv. 5,000 troops, that's it. Okay? And within days, 24, 48 hours, the Ukrainians had compiled a force of about 18,000 troops in Kyiv. And you're looking at an incredibly large city with forests and built-up urban areas around that city. So, very opportunistic environment if you're a defender, and very difficult if you're on the offensive, like the Russians were. And maybe if the Russians had dedicated everything to this operation, or a large portion, maybe 50% of its force construct that went into the Ukraine, if they would have used that in the seizure of Kyiv, maybe. But, taking a city the size of Kyiv and its environments, and then being able to establish logistic networks into the city to hold the city, very difficult to do if you have a fairly motivated opposing force, right, in the Ukrainians, which the Russians found out they had. They were facing a fairly motivated enemy that was it being assisted in terms of intelligence and information by the West, by NATO, by the United States? Yes, absolutely. The Ukrainians probably had as good situational awareness on Russian troop movements as the Russians had on Ukrainian troop movements and deployments. Probably just as good, if not better. Probably better, I would say. Yeah. But you have to look at this because, if, in hindsight, if the Russians had properly built up its forces, right? And again, if you're going to invade and go to war against a country with 40 million people, a sizable industrial base that has been in conflict, limited to some high-intensity conflict over the past several years, since 2014, that you're going to need a bigger force. You just are. And if the Russians had adequately prepared, expanded their ground forces, and if they would have used overwhelming force with that much more sizable ground force component, and they were able to outmatch the Ukrainian military in terms of force size in certain areas, and they had been able to overrun Kyiv, then things may look a lot different than they do today, right? it wouldn't have given the Ukrainians time to kind of adapt, and then that time has given both sides to essentially evolve warfare, right? Warfare that existed in 2022 looks a lot different now in 2026. It just does. And you have to think to yourself, well, boy, if the Russians had done a better job in preparing and planning and understanding that it was going to need a bigger force, it was going to need a bigger army to do what it did. And it wasn't able to do that. And now you're seeing what you're seeing now. And still, as we speak, I'm not completely sure that, and this is pivotal for an armed forces, an effective armed forces, to self-reflect and honestly grade oneself. And if you need to remove a commander that is not innovative, that could be incompetent, you have to do that. And that is, again, platoon commander, platoon leader, all the way up to lieutenant general. I mean, you just have to do it. You have to. You have to self-reflect, and you have to make changes. And are we seeing changes in the Russian military in terms of doctrine? Are we seeing new technologies appearing on the battlefield? Yeah, we are, but it's cause and effect, right? It's a response to something that's happening. I don't think it was true innovation. It's a response to innovation, essentially, is I think what we're seeing right now. And it's going to, and it is. It's causing a lot of casualties on both sides. But again, I think realistically, the number one thing really the Russians did not do well in this conflict is one, size of force, ground forces, because it really lacked this air support capability, this standoff air support capability that you see like in the American Air Force and in other air forces as well. And then ultimately adopting some of those technologies. Those technologies were out there, and the Russians could have adopted some of those technologies and deployed those systems to a much higher level in terms of what they were using them. And they haven't. To this day, I still don't think we're really seeing the Russians adopt the concept of advanced targeting pods. And I know I've said that a lot, but it's case in point that just blows my mind that is something the Russians are not doing. And is it a question of can't or won't? Can't or won't? Is it the lack of the ability to obtain the microprocessors to if you look at the Russian optronics on their helicopters, you can clearly see they're not as stable as their Western counterparts in some areas. And to this day, I mean, I see Russian attack helicopters on the field of battle using unguided rockets, essentially being used as airborne multiple launch rocket systems. They just fire a bunch of rockets in the general direction of where they think an enemy may be on a grid square, and hopefully something hits. But you don't see operations, or at least not a great number of operations being conducted by the Russians where they're using technology to take out Ukrainians. I mean, we're seeing it now to some extent with some of their drones and stuff like that. I mean, but it's really a new type of war that is going to rapidly evolve from here. especially with the introduction of artificial intelligence as well. But again, as a Russian, self-reflect. Your military will be much more capable if you're able to do that. As always, thanks for joining us. More to come very, very soon. Good day.